On the morning of May 24, 2019, the town of New Canaan, Connecticut woke to an early summer quiet that felt ordinary in every possible way. The sunlight was soft, the school rush had begun, and the narrow residential streets carried only the faint rhythm of parents starting another routine Friday. Around 7:30 a.m., a black Chevrolet Suburban moved through this calm landscape. Behind the wheel was Jennifer Farber Dulos, a 50-year-old mother of 5. She had lived in New Canaan for less than 2 years, building a life centered on her children, their school, and the support system she'd created after leaving a turbulent marriage. That morning, she followed the same pattern she had followed countless times before, dropping her children at school, offering them the quiet reassurance of presence and routine. Nothing about the moment suggested that it would be the last verified sighting of her. After leaving the school, Jennifer returned to her home on Wells Lane, a quiet, tree-lined property tucked into one of the area's more secluded neighborhoods. The driveway curved behind tall greenery, creating the kind of privacy that families often appreciated in suburban Connecticut. It was a typical suburban morning, carrying no visible hint that the day would mark the beginning of one of the most high-profile missing person cases in state history. Inside that home, investigators later confirmed Jennifer carried on with the patterns of her morning. Her vehicle was parked in the garage. Her personal belongings, including items she used daily, were inside. There was no indication that she had packed a bag or planned to leave for any extended period of time. No neighbor reported anything out of the ordinary. No unusual vehicle was seen entering or leaving the property. From the outside, everything reflected calm normalcy. But by midday, that normalcy had transformed into silence, an absence that grew heavier with each passing hour. Jennifer failed to attend scheduled appointments that afternoon, something completely out of character for her. She did not answer calls, text messages went unread. No one saw her leaving the property, and as the hours rolled on, the routine predictability of her day began to fracture. By early evening, friends became increasingly alarmed. They contacted authorities, explaining that Jennifer's sudden absence was not only unusual, it was alarming. She was a deeply involved parent, a writer, and someone who maintained consistent contact with those close to her. She was also navigating a contentious divorce and custody battle, circumstances that magnified concerns for her safety. When New Canaan police performed a welfare check at the Wells Lane residence, they stepped into a setting that immediately raised concerns. There was no sign of Jennifer. Her vehicle remained in the garage. Her personal effects were still in the home. There was nothing to indicate voluntary departure. Yet in the garage and on the garage floor, early responders detected what would later be described in legal filings as signs of a possible violent encounter, evidence that shifted the situation instantly from a case of a missing adult to something far more serious. This was the last confirmed point in Jennifer's timeline. A quiet suburban morning, a routine school drop-off, a return home, and then a silence that has never been fully broken. What began as a typical Friday in New Canaan quickly evolved into a moment that would ripple across Connecticut, drawing national attention and prompting an investigation that would stretch for years. From that point onward, every step taken by law enforcement, every piece of forensic analysis, and every lead pursued would attempt to answer a single, haunting question. What happened to Jennifer Dulos after she returned home that morning? The hours following her disappearance would mark a crucial turning point, as law enforcement pieced together the earliest verifiable moments of that day and began to identify the patterns and the anomalies that defined her final known movements. The case would unfold with a complexity few anticipated, involving multiple jurisdictions, extensive forensic work, digital evidence, and legal battles that would capture national attention. Jennifer's disappearance would not only become one of the most scrutinized investigations in Connecticut's modern history, it would also reveal the darker landscape of a relationship unraveling under strain, a custody dispute fraught with suspicion, and a timeline that investigators would reconstruct minute by minute. At the heart of everything was a mother of 5 whose life, until that morning, had been defined largely by resilience, responsibility, and her determination to create stability for her children. Her final documented movements were simple and familiar, and perhaps that is what makes the silence that followed them so deeply unsettling. The abruptness, the lack of warning, the way an ordinary morning became the point at which her story vanished from public view. As investigators would later confirm, Jennifer had been living separately from her estranged husband, Fotis Dulos, who resided in Farmington, Connecticut. Their relationship had deteriorated significantly, marked by a high-conflict divorce and ongoing litigation over custody and finances. Friends, relatives, and court documents described her as fearful, cautious, and attempting to navigate a difficult chapter while prioritizing the well-being of her children. None of that tension appears directly in her final confirmed movements, but it formed the backdrop to everything that followed. It would shape the investigation, it would inform law enforcement strategies, and it would eventually reveal itself in the evidence discovered in the days to come. This opening snapshot, Jennifer's last morning, her return home, and the sudden disappearance that followed, stands as the anchor for the entire case. Every investigative step circles back to this moment. Every breakthrough, every lead, every unanswered question ties itself to the quiet hours between 7:30 a.m. and the time her absence was first reported. In the days, months, and years that followed, this short span of time would become the central focus of a massive investigative effort, one fueled by forensic science, surveillance review, digital data, and legal battles that would capture national attention. This was the moment when everything began. The disappearance of Jennifer Dulos became clearer only when investigators reconstructed her final known timeline, an effort that would uncover the earliest concrete indicators of foul play. What began as a welfare check on the evening of May 24, 2019, quickly transformed into the opening chapter of a major criminal investigation, one shaped not by eyewitness accounts, but by the silent evidence she unknowingly left behind. After Jennifer returned home from dropping off her children that morning, investigators confirmed that her Chevrolet Suburban was parked inside the garage. The home was undisturbed at first glance. There were no signs of forced entry, no doors were broken, and no windows were damaged. The property, surrounded by dense greenery, did not show any unusual tire tracks or disturbances that neighbors could recall. Yet the absence of Jennifer herself, combined with her failure to communicate with friends or attend scheduled appointments, created an immediate sense of unease. What the responding officers initially noticed inside the garage soon elevated that unease into something more urgent. They discovered blood-like stains on the floor, later confirmed through forensic testing to be Jennifer's. There were additional signs suggesting an attempt to clean portions of the area. Although investigators did not release detailed descriptions publicly, court records and arrest warrants later documented these findings as evidence consistent with an event involving significant physical contact inside the garage. This discovery became the first major point in the timeline, a location where investigators believed Jennifer encountered a violent struggle. Inside the home, Jennifer's personal belongings remained where she had left them. Her purse was found. Her phone was later recovered inside the residence. The normal markers of her daily life, the items any parent would carry when running errands of picking up children, were untouched. For detectives, these objects were more than personal effects. They were indicators of a sudden and involuntary disappearance. Jennifer had not walked out voluntarily. She had not left on an errand. Her life had stopped mid-stride. Investigators also noted that the garage showed evidence suggesting that someone may have attempted to alter or conceal what had occurred. The floor carried smear patterns, later examined by forensic teams. Cleaning materials showed signs of use. While nothing pointed conclusively to a full cleanup attempt, the subtle indicators told a consistent story. The scene had been disturbed after Jennifer's blood was deposited there. The next crucial discovery came from outside the home, connected not to the physical structure, but to Jennifer's SUV. At some point after her disappearance, the vehicle was found abandoned in a parking lot in New Canaan, not at her residence and not near any of her known destinations. The SUV had been left at Lapham Road near Waveney Park, a location that raised immediate concern. Waveney Park, with its dense woodlands and miles of trails, was known for its size and accessibility. Its vast terrain would soon become one of the first major search zones. The abandoned SUV offered no signs of Jennifer herself. No one had seen who drove it there, but its presence, far from her home and not aligned with her usual routines, marked another point in the unfolding chain of events. With each hour that passed after the vehicle's discovery, the gravity of the situation deepened. Officers began canvassing the Wells Lane neighborhood, asking neighbors for security footage and reviewing any details from the morning hours. Some security systems captured vehicle movements on nearby roads, but none showed Jennifer leaving the area on foot or in her SUV. The absence of such footage became itself a form of evidence. It reinforced the likelihood that someone else had moved her vehicle after the events inside the garage. As police retraced Jennifer's last known steps, they quickly recognized the tightness of the morning timeline. She dropped her children off shortly after 8 a.m. She was believed to have returned home around that time. Yet by the early afternoon, when she missed her first appointment, something had already happened that prevented her from communicating or leaving the house voluntarily. The timeline between those hours, 8 a.m. to roughly noon, became one of the most critical windows in the entire investigation. While the garage and vehicle offered the earliest physical clues, another critical element emerged through the layout of the Wells Lane property itself. The home was located at the end of a long private driveway, set back from the road and surrounded by trees. This secluded design meant that any events occurring within the garage or backyard area could easily unfold without detection from neighbors or passing cars. Unlike urban settings with constant foot traffic and surveillance, this suburban property allowed for lengthy periods of privacy that investigators later recognized could have played a significant role in the disappearance. Detectives proceeded with caution. They documented every room inside the home. They collected items for forensic testing. They marked stains, examined textiles, and searched for anything that might establish Jennifer's movements or interaction with another person. The house did not reveal signs of a struggle beyond the garage area, but it also did not provide any indication that Jennifer had left willingly. As night fell on May 24, the seriousness of the case expanded. The New Canaan Police Department immediately enlisted assistance from Connecticut State Police and specialized forensic teams. What started as a missing person call had become a potential crime scene within hours. By the next morning, law enforcement launched extensive ground searches. Officers, canine units, drones, and volunteers scoured wooded areas near Waveney Park, focusing initially on the location where Jennifer's SUV was recovered. Trails, retention ponds, and secluded sections of the park were methodically examined. Those searches continued for days, then weeks, but none revealed her whereabouts. During these searches, detectives simultaneously expanded their canvas beyond New Canaan. They reviewed Jennifer's recent communications. They studied her legal filings and the divorce and custody dispute. They examined previous reports and concerns she had shared with the court about her safety. They traced her last confirmed digital activity. All of this contributed to a broader understanding of what her life looked like in the months leading up to her disappearance. Still, the most immediate evidence remained the physical scene: the garage stains, the disturbed debris, and the abandoned vehicle after she had left for a normal morning run to the park. The combination of these details created a chilling but unmistakable outline of events. Jennifer had returned home. Something happened in the garage. Someone else moved her SUV and left it parked near a public area. And in the hours that followed, there was no sign of her again.
Law enforcement officials would later state, through court filings and public updates, that they believed Jennifer was the victim of a violent crime. The evidence inside the garage, in conjunction with the SUV's relocation, pointed toward a coordinated effort to remove both the victim and the vehicle from the property. While investigators avoided public speculation, the direction of the inquiry was clear. They believed someone had confronted her soon after she returned home, and they believed the crime scene showed deliberate attempts to obscure what happened. By the end of the weekend, the case had transformed from a local missing person search into a statewide multi-agency investigation. Every item collected from the home, every smear photographed in the garage, every fiber and swab taken for testing would later form the foundation of a complex forensic narrative, one that would eventually lead to arrests, charges, and courtroom testimony. But in those early days, the facts remained stark, clear, and inescapable. Jennifer Dulos had vanished. Her garage contained physical evidence of a violent event. Her vehicle had been abandoned away from her home, and in the hours that followed, there was no sign of her again. Those facts, fixed, clear, and inescapable, marked the beginning of a case that would soon draw national attention and reveal a trail of evidence extending far beyond New Canaan.
When New Canaan police first entered Jennifer Dulos's home on the evening of May 24, 2019, they were responding to a welfare request fueled by growing concern. Friends, unable to reach her for hours, feared not just an emergency, but something unimaginable. Jennifer was reliable, present, and deeply committed to her children. Silence from her was never casual. The officers who stepped into the Wells Lane residence approached the scene with the mindset of locating a missing mother. But the moment they surveyed the garage, the nature of the call changed. It was no longer a routine missing person case. The small but unmistakable indicators inside the garage created immediate urgency. And by the time officers completed their initial walkthrough of the home, the situation had shifted toward what they described as a potentially dangerous and active crime scenario. The house was quiet. Jennifer was nowhere inside. The rooms showed no sign of hurried departure, no indication of a planned trip or sudden errand. The calm organization of the space contrasted sharply with the stains found on the garage floor, stains that would later be identified as her blood. From the earliest minutes, officers understood they were standing in a location where something significant had occurred. As darkness settled over New Canaan, the investigation escalated rapidly. Supervisors, detectives, and additional units were called to the scene. Photographs were taken. Evidence markers were placed. Every portion of the garage, every item on the floor, and every surface that showed disturbance was documented. The home itself was carefully examined room by room, though no additional major disturbances were found elsewhere. Detectives collected swabs, samples, textiles, and potential trace evidence. The forensic work unfolded slowly and meticulously because investigators understood that this home represented the last confirmed place Jennifer had been. Every detail mattered. Every mark, every smear, every fiber had the potential to reveal where she went, how she left, and who may have been present. Outside the home, officers expanded their focus. The discovery of Jennifer's SUV in a parking area near Wavini Park became a second focal point of activity. The vehicle was secured and transported for forensic examination. Investigators searched inside it for signs of Jennifer's belongings, fingerprints, or any indication of who had driven it there. No direct evidence of Jennifer herself was found inside the SUV, a detail that only deepened the mystery. Meanwhile, Wavini Park was quickly identified as a priority search area. As one of New Canaan's largest and densest stretches of public land, it presented both opportunity and challenge. Officers began searching trails, wooded paths, water features, and remote pockets of the park. Canine teams swept through brush-lined areas, detecting scents and guiding officers into deeper terrain. These searches extended into the evening and resumed at first light the following morning. Within hours, the New Canaan Police Department partnered with Connecticut State Police, bringing additional resources, helicopters, specialized units, and larger-scale search capability. The collaboration marked a turning point. What began as a local concern had reached the level of a sprawling, multi-agency effort. The following day, May 25th, search teams deployed across multiple zones. Volunteers assisted in lesser sensitive areas, while trained personnel focused on parklands, waterways, and surrounding neighborhoods. Drones equipped with thermal imaging were sent into the sky. Officers walked mile after mile through rugged terrain. Cadaver dogs were utilized in several high-probability areas. Even in these early hours, the public became acutely aware that something serious had occurred. New Canaan, a town accustomed to quiet routines, suddenly witnessed a surge of police activity. Residents saw patrol cars stationed at intersections, search teams moving in formation, and state vehicles entering and exiting Wells Lane. Media outlets began reporting on a missing mother of 5, which accelerated public attention. The case's visibility grew by the minute. By the end of the first 48 hours, Jennifer's disappearance was no longer a private tragedy. It was a statewide priority. Information hotlines were activated. The media circulated images of Jennifer, urging anyone who had seen her or her vehicle to come forward. But despite the rapid spread of information, tips remained limited, and none immediately changed the direction of the search. Inside the command posts set up by law enforcement, detectives refined the timeline. They examined Jennifer's digital activity, including her phone, computer, and email records. They documented her last confirmed communications the morning she vanished. All digital indicators showed the same thing. Her activity stopped abruptly after she returned home. That sudden digital silence became one of the most important clues in the investigation. It showed that Jennifer did not take her phone with her. It also highlighted that no messages, calls, or browsing occurred after her last known movement. Her phone simply went still. Detectives cross-checked this information with interviews from friends, attorneys, and school personnel. Jennifer had been expected to attend multiple appointments that afternoon. She did not arrive at any of them. This reinforced the conclusion that something had happened during the narrow window between dropping off her children and the early afternoon hours. As searches continued, investigators documented every relevant physical detail at the Wells Lane home. They photographed footprints, potential shoe impressions, tire patterns, and anything that might later connect to suspects or additional scenes. Specialized luminol testing and blood detection techniques were employed inside the garage, confirming the presence of multiple sites where Jennifer's blood had been deposited. Though investigators did not publicly disclose the depth or distribution of the blood evidence at the time, later filings described the garage as containing signs of a serious physical assault, suggesting that detectives understood early on they were dealing with far more than a missing person case. Even as the forensic work expanded, officers remained focused on recovering Jennifer herself. The park searches intensified. Canals, drainage areas, and retention ponds were examined with equipment designed to detect submerged objects. Additional wooded regions beyond Wavini Park were explored. The search areas gradually expanded into nearby towns, including Pound Ridge and other adjacent communities. The public response grew quickly as well. Residents organized volunteer search groups distributed flyers, and assisted by providing security footage from home cameras. Businesses and residents across New Canaan helped law enforcement collect video recordings from the morning of May 24th, hoping to identify unusual vehicle patterns or unfamiliar movement near Wells Lane or Wavini Park. But despite these efforts, no one came forward with a confirmed sighting of Jennifer after the school drop-off. This absence of witness accounts further solidified the belief that the event occurred privately, likely within her own garage, and likely very soon after she returned home. As officers continued to examine the evidence, investigators also began reviewing Jennifer's recent life circumstances. They examined her divorce filings, court motions, and custody documents, which included statements expressing her concerns about her estranged husband. These documents did not serve as evidence on their own, but they provided context that investigators could not ignore. Still, the case remained anchored to the evidence on the ground. The garage told one part of the story, the SUV told another, and the park searches continued to expand with urgency. At this early stage, no arrests had been made, no suspects had been publicly named, and investigators remained focused on locating Jennifer and understanding the circumstances of her disappearance. In the days that followed, the investigation rapidly scaled beyond New Canaan. Additional search warrants were issued. Forensic laboratories began analyzing samples collected from the home and vehicle. Technicians compared stains, fibers, and chemical traces. They examined potential cleanup patterns and documented the condition of every surface. The public reaction intensified as the disappearance made headlines across Connecticut and the broader region. Media outlets covered ground searches live. Community members expressed concern, offering tips and support. Jennifer's family released statements through attorneys, urging vigilance and cooperation with law enforcement. Yet despite the broad attention and the immense resources deployed, the most important discovery in the early stages of the Jennifer Dulos investigation were marked by urgency, but they were also shaped by limitations that slowed progress. For all the evidence uncovered in the garage in the abandoned SUV, substantial gaps remained. Gaps that investigators were forced to navigate carefully as they pieced together the movements, motives, and potential participants connected to her disappearance. In the first week, law enforcement poured resources into ground searches and forensic testing. But even with these efforts, a major challenge confronted them immediately. There were no eyewitnesses to Jennifer's return home, no visual record of her entering the house, and no confirmed sightings of her afterward. The discovery of her blood in the garage established that something serious had occurred, yet the absence of direct witnesses left investigators relying heavily on physical evidence, digital breadcrumbs, and the unfolding behaviors of those connected to her life. One of the earliest stumbling blocks appeared in the form of limited surveillance coverage. New Canaan, like many suburban neighborhoods, had significant gaps in camera placement. Many homes had private security systems, but not all of them captured street activity or driveway access points. And those that did often lacked high-resolution footage or faced angles that made it difficult to identify vehicles or license plates with certainty. As detectives reviewed recordings from the morning and afternoon of May 24, they identified patterns of traffic but found few clips that directly captured the movements of individuals connected to Jennifer. This forced them to rely on partial information, shadows of vehicles, brief glimpses of taillights, or footage obscured by foliage. Each video had value, but integrating these incomplete visuals into a coherent timeline proved slow and painstaking. Early interviews added another layer of complexity. Friends and family provided insight into Jennifer's state of mind and her recent concerns, but these personal accounts could not serve as evidence. What they did do, however, was guide investigators toward individuals who needed closer scrutiny. Chief among them was her estranged husband, Dulos, with whom she had been involved in a lengthy and contentious legal battle. Fotis Dulos' initial statements and actions drew immediate attention, not because of direct evidence tying him to the crime scene, but because of contradictions that emerged early on. He denied involvement in Jennifer's disappearance, asserting he had not seen her in years. While he cooperated with some aspects of the investigation, detectives noted inconsistencies between his statements and the timeline they were developing. Yet inconsistencies alone did not constitute proof. And despite the mounting concern surrounding his behavior, investigators lacked concrete evidence in the earliest phase to detain him or file charges related to Jennifer's disappearance. At the same time, the involvement of Michelle Trocanis, who was dating Fotis at the time, presented another investigative challenge. Her statements varied across interviews, creating confusion and complicating efforts to establish a consistent narrative. In later legal proceedings, these discrepancies would become significant, but during the early phase, they represented another difficult hurdle for investigators, attempting to distinguish between inaccurate recollections, protective behavior, or deliberate misinformation. While authorities moved quickly to secure warrants for digital devices, vehicles, and properties associated with Fotis, another challenge emerged. Many of the potential locations tied to Fotis, his home in Farmington, a property in Avon, and vehicles he used regularly, required extensive search efforts. These locations were large, often spread out, and required time-consuming forensic analysis. Every search needed to be methodical, legally sound, and documented with precision. The process slowed the investigation, but was necessary to ensure that any evidence collected would hold up in court. Meanwhile, digital evidence, phones, computers, GPS data, and electronic communication required specialized analysis. Extracting data from multiple electronic devices took weeks, often longer. And even when the data was accessed, investigators faced another limitation. Digital movements could confirm where a device traveled, but not necessarily who possessed the device at a given time. This ambiguity created additional layers of uncertainty, especially when analyzing the movements of devices associated with Fotis and Michelle during the critical time frame. Another critical complication occurred in the form of potential evidence destruction. As later court filings revealed, investigators suspected that key evidence, items linked to Jennifer's disappearance, had been removed, altered, or discarded before police could recover it. These suspicions were reinforced when surveillance footage eventually surfaced, showing activity in Hartford involving the disposal of bags. But in the earliest phase of the investigation, detectives were still working to confirm these details. Without immediate confirmation, their efforts remained hampered by the possibility that significant evidence had been lost. The delays compounded during the first week. Forensic laboratories worked at capacity, analyzing the samples collected from the garage and abandoned SUV. Investigators awaited toxicology reports, blood pattern interpretations, trace fiber comparisons, and other forensic results. Each report required time that families, the media, and the public struggled to understand, but that investigators needed to avoid jeopardizing the case. Meanwhile, the search for Jennifer expanded into rural areas, rivers, and private lands. But even these searches encountered limitations. Weather conditions affected canine detection. Water levels in certain areas fluctuated, altering search strategies. And the sheer size of the wooded and rural zones, combined with property ownership restrictions, slowed progress further. Investigators continued conducting interviews and gathering statements, yet statements from key individuals shifted repeatedly. Each change required re-evaluation of the timeline. Each contradiction forced detectives to compare these accounts with the developing forensic narrative. It created a cycle of re-interviews, clarifications, and follow-up questions. Additionally, the public's growing interest in the case added pressure to the investigation process. Media outlets reported new details quickly, sometimes relying on incomplete information. Rumors circulated online. Community discussions speculated about the case's direction. Though investigators maintained strict control over official information, the public discourse sometimes complicated the investigation by generating misinformation that detectives needed to address or clarify. The legal complexity of Jennifer's divorce and custody dispute introduced another layer of difficulty. Court documents contained accusations, concerns, and previous incidents that investigators needed to review carefully. While these records provided essential context, they could not serve as evidence of a crime. Distinguishing between relevant information and extraneous details required meticulous work, adding further time to the early investigation. During this phase, some of the leads investigators pursued simply dissolved. Searches in Waveney Park yielded no significant results. Multiple tips, though well-intentioned, led to dead ends. Drone sweeps covered large areas but revealed nothing connected to Jennifer. Water searches required specialized divers, but even those meticulous efforts provided no breakthroughs. The investigation spanned days, then weeks, and while detectives continued to assemble pieces of a complex puzzle, public frustration grew. The absence of immediate arrests fueled speculation. But from a law enforcement perspective, the lack of early charges reflected not hesitation, but strategy. Prosecutors needed a case built on solid, admissible evidence, one capable of supporting the severe charges that investigators suspected the facts would eventually justify. Throughout this phase, investigators focused on building the timeline as precisely as possible. They mapped out vehicle movements. They analyzed inconsistencies. They worked to identify gaps in surveillance coverage. They compared forensic data across multiple locations. And slowly, through careful analysis, a pattern began to emerge. This pattern would become the turning point in the case. But before that breakthrough arrived, investigators were forced to confront the reality of what they did not yet know. They lacked a confirmed location of Jennifer after she returned home. They lacked video showing her leaving the property. They lacked direct evidence of the sequence of events inside the garage. And most importantly, they had not yet identified the path that led from the Wells Lane home to the abandoned vehicle and beyond. The early failures of the investigation were not the result of oversight or neglect. They were the product of a case defined by secrecy, timing, and deliberate action. Someone acted quickly. Someone removed evidence. Someone exploited the natural privacy of suburban geography. And someone moved with enough calculation to create obstacles that took time for investigators to dismantle. But slowly, those obstacles began to crumble. As surveillance footage, forensic analysis, and digital data converged, investigators found themselves standing on the edge of a revealing narrative, one that would take the evidence from New Canaan to Hartford, through miles of recorded footage and a trail of discarded items. This next phase would produce the breakthroughs that reshaped the investigation, linked suspects to key evidence, and established the foundation for the charges that followed.
The turning point in the Jennifer Dulos investigation did not arrive from a single discovery. It emerged from the meticulous accumulation of small details, tiny fragments of surveillance footage, digital records, and forensic evidence that slowly began to align. For weeks, investigators worked through contradictions, early gaps, and dead ends. But by the middle of June 2019, a clearer path started to form. It was a path that would ultimately connect the events at Jennifer's home to a series of actions unfolding miles away, across a different city, on the same day she vanished. The most significant shift began with a review of surveillance footage from Hartford, Connecticut. This footage came not from residential neighborhoods or suburban intersections, but from a stretch of Albany Avenue, a busy commercial corridor lined with storefronts, traffic lights, and municipal cameras. The Hartford Police Department assisted New Canaan detectives by gathering hours of video from multiple intersections and commercial buildings. As investigators combed through the material, they noticed something striking. In the early evening of May 24, the day Jennifer disappeared, a black Ford Raptor pickup truck appeared repeatedly along the same stretch of Albany Avenue. The vehicle made slow, deliberate stops at garbage bins positioned along the sidewalks, public trash receptacles used frequently by pedestrians and businesses. At several locations, the truck pulled over, paused, and a man was seen getting out of the passenger side to discard what appeared to be garbage bags. At other moments, an individual leaned into the bins, depositing smaller items. This footage, captured across multiple camera angles, became the first concrete link between a suspect's movements and Jennifer's disappearance. Investigators compared the truck in the footage to vehicles associated with Fotis Dulos. They quickly confirmed that Fotis owned a black Ford Raptor matching the one recorded along Albany Avenue. This was a substantial development. It placed a vehicle tied to Fotis in Hartford on the evening of Jennifer's disappearance, nearly 70 miles from New Canaan. But it wasn't only the truck's presence that stood out. It was the pattern of behavior, the repetitive nature of the stops, the disposal of multiple items, and the timing, precisely on the same day Jennifer went missing. Detectives expanded their review of the surveillance material. They synchronized timestamps from different cameras to reconstruct the truck's route. They identified at least 30 locations where stops occurred. And importantly, at several points they captured images of two individuals associated with the truck, a man believed to be Fotis Dulos and a woman whose appearance matched that of Michelle Troconis. This discovery shifted the investigation from uncertain early theory into a focused pursuit of evidence disposal. With this breakthrough, investigators retrieved the trash bags deposited along Albany Avenue. Many had already been collected by sanitation workers, but enough remained accessible for forensic analysis. Inside these recovered bags, investigators found items later described in arrest warrants: clothing, sponges, towels, and elements containing traces of Jennifer's blood. One item bore DNA linking back to Fotis himself. For detectives, this forensic connection marked a critical moment. It established a direct line between the evidence found in Jennifer's garage and trash bags discarded in Hartford by individuals connected to her estranged husband. It linked two distant locations, New Canaan and Hartford, through the presence of Jennifer's blood, items used to clean a crime scene, and clear video of the disposal activity. This connection became the spine of the case. The next breakthrough came through forensic testing of the items recovered. Analysts confirmed that multiple objects contained Jennifer's DNA. Some items also held DNA mixtures, suggesting contact from more than one individual. Although investigators did not publicly disclose all details, court documents would later reveal a pattern consistent with cleanup efforts following Jennifer's disappearance. Another pivotal development involved the examination of Jennifer's Suburban. Investigators scrutinized the vehicle for fingerprints, biological material, and trace evidence. They evaluated the position of the seats, the condition of the interior, and any signs indicating who last drove the vehicle. Although direct evidence within the SUV was limited, the vehicle's placement near Waveney Park, combined with the forensic findings at her home and the Hartford trash disposal video, helped create a transactional timeline. This timeline suggested a sequence. Jennifer was attacked in the garage, evidence was removed from the scene, her vehicle was driven and abandoned, and cleanup materials were transported and later discarded in Hartford. Digital evidence further strengthened this timeline. Investigators reviewed cell phone records from devices linked to Fotis and Michelle Troconis. They analyzed pings, movement data, and communications. The patterns revealed that the devices traveled through areas consistent with the Ford Raptor's movements captured on video. These digital markers did not identify who held each device at each moment, but they corroborated the truck's route along Albany Avenue. Parallel to these efforts, investigators executed search warrants at Fotis Dulos' residence in Farmington. The property spanned several acres and included multiple structures. Inside, forensic teams collected additional evidence, including items later referenced in legal proceedings. Vehicles associated with Fotis and with his business operations were examined. Computer systems were seized. Storage locations were searched. The results of these efforts added layers to the growing body of material that pointed to deliberate cleanup efforts following Jennifer's disappearance. One particularly telling discovery was the presence of what investigators described as blood evidence on items linked to Fotis' home or business operations. Although these findings were not as extensive as those in the garage, they further supported the theory that materials connected to the crime scene had been transported. Together, these breakthroughs began tightening the case. Another crucial moment came from interviews. As investigators confronted individuals with surveillance footage, digital data, and forensic results, contradictions in earlier statements became more pronounced. In particular, statements from Michelle Troconis shifted over time in ways that raised concern. In later court records, authorities noted several inconsistencies and contradictions that further aligned with the forensic evidence rather than the accounts provided. At the same time, investigative focus expanded to include properties associated with Fotis's business, Fore Group, which managed multiple construction sites and real estate holdings. These sites offered potential locations where evidence could have been temporarily stored, altered, or disposed of. Searches extended to lots, construction areas, wooded sections, and drainage locations. Though these searches did not yield Jennifer herself, they added valuable context to the pattern of movements investigators now believed had occurred. Digital forensic analysis continued to provide crucial breakthroughs. Emails, GPS coordinates, and phone records painted a clearer picture of the hours immediately following Jennifer's disappearance. Investigators established windows of time during which devices moved through Hartford, paused near garbage bins, and returned to Farmington. Each segment of the route corresponded with surveillance footage and with the locations where trash bags were recovered. As these findings solidified, investigators assembled the elements into a comprehensive evidence chain. It began at Jennifer's home, with the blood found in the garage. It continued with the abandoned Suburban. It expanded with surveillance footage capturing the disposal of items, and it was reinforced by forensic confirmation of blood-stained materials recovered from those garbage bags. This convergence formed the core of the case that investigators would later present to prosecutors. The level of detail, the consistency of the forensic evidence, and the alignment of digital and visual data created a unified narrative. Jennifer had been the victim of a violent crime, and individuals connected to her estranged husband had participated in its aftermath, including the removal and disposal of evidence. By late June 2019, after weeks of intense investigative work, the case had moved from the realm of uncertainty into one supported by strong probable cause. Multiple arrests would soon follow, including charges related to tampering with evidence and hindering prosecution. And though the investigation continued to unfold over the following months, and the full legal process would take years, the breakthroughs achieved during this phase formed the backbone of all future charges, court filings, and judicial outcomes. This was the moment the case stopped struggling against early gaps and finally found structure. This was the moment the evidence began to speak clearly. And this was the moment investigators recognized they were pursuing not only a missing person search, but the shadow of a homicide.
The breakthroughs investigators uncovered in the weeks following Jennifer Dulos' disappearance created the foundation for a series of decisive legal actions. By mid-2019, what began as a missing person search had become a tightly structured criminal case, one built on forensic evidence, surveillance documentation, digital analysis, and a timeline that consistently pointed toward a coordinated effort to conceal a violent crime. The first arrests occurred on June 1, 2019, just 8 days after Jennifer vanished. New Canaan police, working closely with state authorities, issued arrest warrants for Fotis Dulos and Michelle Troconis. Both were charged with tampering with evidence and hindering prosecution, charges rooted in the surveillance footage from Hartford and the forensic results from the recovered trash bags. The items discarded along Albany Avenue, clothing, sponges, towels, and materials saturated with Jennifer's blood, formed the core of these early charges. These arrests marked a turning point in public perception. For the first time, individuals connected to Jennifer's disappearance were formally accused of participating in actions designed to obscure evidence. Though the initial charges were limited to tampering and hindering, they signaled that investigators had gathered enough admissible evidence to initiate the criminal justice process. In the weeks that followed, investigators continued to expand the evidence base. Additional warrants were executed at properties associated with Fotis, including his home in Farmington and sites connected to his construction business. Authorities seized vehicles, electronics, tools, and documents. Forensic teams conducted further analysis on items recovered from both New Canaan and Hartford. Each new test, sample, and report added detail to the sequence of events investigators believed had occurred. Despite the ongoing investigation, the legal process gradually accelerated. In September 2019, Fotis and Michelle were arrested a second time, charged again with tampering with evidence. These additional charges reflected investigators' belief that the individuals had engaged in further actions on or after May 24 to alter or conceal material connected to Jennifer's disappearance. Filings revealed that some of these actions were linked to vehicle usage, cleaning efforts, and suspicious behaviors documented through digital records. But the most significant legal development arrived months later, after investigators assembled a deeper forensic narrative that extended well beyond evidence disposal. On January 7, 2020, Connecticut authorities issued an arrest warrant charging Fotis Dulos with murder, felony murder, and kidnapping. These were the most serious charges possible in connection with Jennifer's disappearance. The affidavit spanned multiple pages and detailed the evidence linking Fotis to the events of May 24. Though investigators avoided releasing unnecessary specifics, the warrant summarized key facts. Jennifer's blood was found in her garage. Items containing her blood were found in trash bags linked to Fotis. Video placed his truck along the route where evidence was discarded. Digital data aligned with movements consistent with evidence disposal. Physical traces connected him to the cleanup efforts. The combination of these findings created the probable cause necessary for murder charges. It was a major development, one that reflected the culmination of months of investigative effort. Alongside Fotis, both Michelle Troconis and Kent Mahoney, an associate of Fotis, were charged with conspiracy to commit murder. These charges stemmed from statements, digital records, and actions investigators believed demonstrated coordinated efforts to plan, support, or conceal aspects of the crime and its aftermath. The arrests were significant for another reason. They represented the first formal acknowledgement by the state that investigators believed Jennifer had been killed, despite the fact that her body had not been located. This made the case one of Connecticut's most prominent no-body homicide prosecutions. Fotis Dulos was taken into custody, but later released on a $6 million bond while awaiting trial. In late January 2020, however, the legal process took an abrupt and dramatic turn. Facing extensive charges and public scrutiny, Fotis attempted suicide at his Farmington home. He was transported to a hospital in critical condition and died several days later. His death meant that the charges against him were never adjudicated, leaving certain aspects of the case legally unresolved. Despite Fotis's death, the prosecution continued against his co-defendants. Investigators remained focused on holding accountable any individuals believed to have played a role in the events surrounding Jennifer's disappearance. The case against Michelle Troconis progressed slowly through the courts, delayed by procedural issues and the broader impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Over time, the evidence presented by prosecutors expanded. They documented inconsistencies in her interviews, her presence in the surveillance footage, and her participation in conduct investigators stated was part of an effort to mislead authorities and conceal evidence. In 2024, after a lengthy trial, a jury found Michelle Troconis guilty on multiple charges: conspiracy to commit murder, hindering prosecution in the second degree, and multiple counts of tampering with evidence. Her conviction represented one of the most significant legal outcomes in the case. Although Michelle was not charged with direct participation in Jennifer's death, the jury concluded that she had taken part in actions connected to planning, cleanup, or interference with the investigation. As for Kent Maroney, his legal proceedings followed a separate path. He faced charges of conspiracy to commit murder, and his case moved through its own timeline. While the final outcomes varied, investigators viewed all three individuals, Fotis, Michelle, and Kent, as part of the constellation of events tied to Jennifer's disappearance. The charges filed across these cases reflected key evidentiary points. The blood in Jennifer's garage established a violent crime at the home. The abandoned SUV established the relocation of her vehicle. The Hartford surveillance footage established the disposal of items containing her blood, and forensic analysis of discarded items established a direct link between the cleanup materials and individuals connected to her estranged husband. The digital records established the movements of devices aligning with the path of evidence disposal. The contradictions and shifting narratives in interviews added further weight to the prosecution's claims. Though Fotis's death prevented a full trial from ever unfolding, prosecutors made clear that the evidence collected had met their threshold for murder charges. That evidence, assembled through the combined work of multiple agencies, created one of the most robust no-body homicide cases in Connecticut's history. The legal resolution also underscored the complexity of investigating a disappearance where the victim's body has not been located. Prosecutors relied heavily on forensic science, surveillance data, and circumstantial evidence, elements which, together, painted a compelling and detailed picture of what occurred. But even with these legal milestones, the case was not considered fully closed. Jennifer's remains have never been located. That absence continues to shape the case's legacy, the public's understanding of what happened, and the emotional experience of the family who continues to live with unanswered questions. Still, within the legal framework, the resolution phase brought clarity. Charges were filed, evidence was validated, convictions were secured, and the central narrative, supported by forensic results, video documentation, and investigative analysis, was presented clearly before the courts and the public. This is where the investigative journey, in its legal form, reached its most definitive moment. But the human story did not end here. The aftermath left behind ripples across communities, families, and the broader landscape of domestic violence awareness. It also left behind lingering questions rooted in the one element still missing from the case: the location of Jennifer. Those complexities shaped the final chapter of this documentary.
In the years following Jennifer Dulos' disappearance, the case continued to cast a long, unbroken shadow across Connecticut. The legal proceedings, the forensic work, and the public attention eventually reached moments of resolution, but the deeper human impact remained, quiet, enduring, and profoundly shaped by the absence at the center of everything. For Jennifer's family, the aftermath was defined not by court hearings or investigatory milestones, but by a daily life forever altered. Her 5 children were placed in the care of Jennifer's mother, where they remained throughout the duration of the legal process. They grew up under a shield of privacy, protected as much as possible from the public lens and the emotional complexity of a case that touched every part of their world. The children were young when Jennifer disappeared. Their lives moved forward, not with closure, but with the lasting reality of a mother who never came home. For Jennifer's relatives, grief existed alongside endurance. They released periodic statements through family representatives, always measured, always dignified, and always grounded in the commitment to keep Jennifer's name alive. Their message centered on gratitude for law enforcement, the community, and the people who refused to let the case fade from public memory. Even as court filings made headlines and new evidence was revealed in legal settings, the family remained focused on a simple truth: Jennifer was missing, and they had not stopped hoping for answers. The community of New Canaan experienced its own transformation. A town known for its calm suburban rhythm became the backdrop of one of the most widely covered cases in the state's history. For months, residents joined search efforts,
coordinated support networks, and worked closely with investigators by sharing home security footage and information. Parks, forests, and public lands became canvassing grounds. Flyers with Jennifer's photo hung in storefront windows, community centers, and public boards. Residents described a shift in the way they viewed safety, domestic conflict, and missing person investigations. The visibility of the case prompted conversations about domestic violence, legal protections, and the vulnerabilities individuals may face even in environments that appear outwardly peaceful. Many of these conversations continued long after the initial search efforts ended. The legal proceedings surrounding the case also shaped statewide discussions about no-body homicide cases. Prosecutors and investigators highlighted the complexities involved, emphasizing the role of forensic science and digital evidence in establishing criminal liability even when a victim has not been recovered. The case became a touchpoint for examining how modern investigations rely on surveillance networks, GPS records, and microscopic trace analysis to reconstruct events with scientific precision. Yet, even with the legal clarity achieved through the conviction of Michelle Troconis and the charges filed against others, many questions remained. The most central of these was the one that investigators, prosecutors, and the public still could not answer. Where was Jennifer? Despite extensive searches across multiple towns, forests, rivers, and private lands, Jennifer's remains were never found. Search teams revisited locations based on new information, seasonal changes, or expanded technological tools, but none produced a definitive discovery. This absence created a significant emotional weight for the family and for those who followed the case closely. It also left investigators with the challenge of knowing that the final piece of the story remained physically unrecovered. For Connecticut authorities, the aftermath involved a long-term commitment. Even after the major legal proceedings concluded, the case was not officially closed. Investigators continued to review tips, evaluate new information, and maintain open lines of communication with Jennifer's family. The Connecticut State Police kept the case classified as an ongoing investigation, acknowledging that unresolved questions still remained and that recovery efforts would persist as long as necessary. The case also influenced policy discussions throughout the region. Advocates used Jennifer's story to highlight the complexities of domestic violence, emphasizing the importance of early intervention, judicial safeguards, and protective measures for individuals navigating high-conflict separations or custody disputes. Organizations dedicated to victims' rights cited the case in public education campaigns, using it to strengthen resources for families facing similar circumstances. Media coverage, which had been intense in the early months of the investigation, gradually transformed into long-form documentaries, news specials, and legal analyses. Each piece revisited the evidence, the timeline, and the unfolding of events, but often returned to the same point: the profound impact of Jennifer's disappearance and the enduring significance of the forensic and investigative work that followed. In the broader community, the legacy of the case rested in the way it reshaped public consciousness. Residents reflected on the fragility of safety, the hidden dimensions of relationships, and the courage required for individuals to seek protection and rebuild their lives. Jennifer's story became emblematic, not only of a specific crime, but of a larger societal challenge: how communities respond when someone disappears under circumstances that defy understanding. For those who worked directly on the case, from detectives to forensic technicians to prosecutors, the experience left an indelible mark. Many describe the investigation as one of the most complex of their careers, not only because of the evidence trail, but because of the emotional weight carried by everyone involved. Each discovery, each lead, each setback reinforced the responsibility they carried to uncover the truth and pursue justice for Jennifer. The aftermath also revealed the complicated nature of resolving a case when key individuals never stand trial. Fotis Dulos' death closed one legal pathway, but opened new questions in public discourse about accountability, evidence interpretation, and the impact of a defendant's death
on the pursuit of truth. Though prosecutors made clear that the evidence supporting his charges met legal thresholds, the absence of a full trial left some elements permanently unresolved. Despite these uncertainties, the central narrative remained intact. Investigators had followed the evidence, courts had heard the testimony, a jury had weighed the facts, and the legal system had reached its conclusions. Through every phase, Jennifer's family remained steadfast in their focus, protecting her children, upholding her memory, and honoring her life. Today, the case stands in a state of partial resolution, legally significant, emotionally complex, and still open in its most essential question. Search efforts persist when new information arises. Investigators maintain readiness for any development, and the community continues to remember the woman at the heart of the case, not for the circumstances of her disappearance, but for the life she lived and the family she loved. The impact of Jennifer Dulos' story extends far beyond the events of May 24, 2019. It lives in every court ruling shaped by her case, every safety measure revisited because of her experience, every conversation held in her memory, and every individual who continues to hope that the unanswered questions may one day find resolution. And so, even as legal chapters close and years continue to pass, the pursuit of truth remains active. Jennifer's family continues to seek clarity. Investigators continue to seek answers. The community continues to seek closure. And the world continues to remember her. Share this story. Keep her name alive, because someone, somewhere, still holds the final piece of truth about what happened to Jennifer Dulos.